We all know that the right habits and mindsets can be transformational in how we live our lives. But among the sea of advice online, it can be challenging to know who to trust with these important life decisions. At The Standard, we answer those questions and introduce you to some of the most successful people in the world in their fields and the habits and the mindsets they've used to achieve their success. To learn more about our social platform, head on over to www.thestandardapp.com. And now, your host, myself, Chris Palatroni. Welcome to another episode of The Standard. I am your host, Chris Palatroni, and today's guest is Ben Sears. He is a yoga professional, used to be teaching in the south of France, and he has moved his practice and his retreats to Montana. And as you'll see, if you watch this on YouTube, such a beautiful location that he's based in. This was a really fun conversation. He has a very witty personality. There's definitely a comedic aspect to it, but he's also very humble. And he also just talks very real. He doesn't sugarcoat anything, but he provides a very thorough explanation as to why he does what he does and the benefit that he receives from it. So he also had a very interesting take on his best habit. So usually I get a very specific habit. And in this case, it was more of a practice. And it was really a practice for him that I took away that's still under construction, but something that has had a very significant impact on his life as he sort of raised the bar into the way that he's living and the things that he needs. He also had a very interesting take on mindset. So we talked a little bit about focus and forgiveness and momentum, and we talked about how to build momentum when you're not motivated. I definitely tease out of him the value of nature and the impact it's had on his life and where he lives, because I love nature, and I think it's just something we should all be getting more into. So really fun conversation. So without further ado, I want to welcome Ben Sears. No, well, I mean, first of all, Ben, really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I was looking at my notes here. I'd reached out to you, almost over a year ago, as I started to work on building The Standard. And you were kind enough to give me some of your time. And, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I've enjoyed your sort of following you through social media.
Thanks.
And, hearing the way you bring your practice and some of the practicality of your life to life. So yeah, it's just such an honor to have you. And I actually think, as I'm sort of like scrolling through my guest count, you're our first true yoga professional.
Oh, really? I mean, I don't know what qualifies someone as a true yoga professional, especially because that's a sort of question that I wrestle with as my practice and career have, evolved and shifted and changed, and just years have passed and things change. But I'm sort of hesitant to claim that title these days. I mean, I guess professional is just something you do for your job.
Yeah, well, we'll just say you're on the journey and you try to inspire and enlighten people along the way. So
totally. I did hear a funny quote recently from a friend of mine said, even if you call your life a journey, it doesn't make it any less of a disaster.
I'm
so
sure many
what you're
people
getting with me is like a little bit of sort of old salt, ancient mariner disenchantment at times with some of what I find to be the like well-wrapped vacuousness that we can find in all these different spiritual communities. But, nonetheless, I embody the cliches. I'm here with my long hair sitting on a porch in Montana. So here we go.
I love it. I'm actually very jealous that I don't live somewhere in the country like Montana. But let's do this right. So, I know a fair amount about your background. And sort of when you got started and, you're moving from France to Montana, but, a lot of the listeners that are going to listen to this may not have as much context. And so rather than me sort of butcher your background a little bit, what I'd love you to do is just take a couple minutes and sort of walk us through like, who is Ben and, what do you do? How do you help other people? Essentially, how did you get to this chair sitting at your house in Montana?
Yeah, well, there's the chronology of that story, and then there's the who is Ben question, which is one that I don't think I'll ever completely answer. So who is Ben? Ben's a guy who's really good at creating experiences for other people to walk through the doors that they choose to gain insight about themselves through different practices or simply experiences. And the experience side of things is something that I shied away from for a long time, even though I was doing it as my work in running retreat centers. But ultimately, what I am interested in doing is creating, holistic is the wrong word, but I would say complete immersive experiences that allow people to see how practice and just living well can integrate to create a well-examined and well-lived life. And that all sounds kind of nebulous, but what it really means is that, like, people come here to Montana, or they come to, they came to France where I was for 15 years, and we just give people a really beautiful experience with great food in a beautiful place that's well curated but not snooty, and they walk away feeling like, oh, it matters what kind of food I eat. It matters the kind
Yeah.
of people that I surround myself with. It matters the way I organize my day and how I use my time. Quality matters, So
Yeah.
that's what's important to me. And all the different practices are kind of just delivery systems for refining the way that one's able to pay attention. And then I think sometimes those of us that are very dedicated to certain practices, or have been for a long time, sometimes can hide in those practices. But it's really about not just how well you do your yoga practice or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of things that I do that are not yoga, or wouldn't be
Yeah.
considered yoga by an angry traditionalist, I guess. And so it's ultimately like, how does my practice support the other stuff I want to do, like creating this space for in Montana for people to come and like find themselves and feel better about themselves, and ultimately be
Yeah.
generating enough revenue that I can do really cool pro bono work and have like kids come here and be in nature
Yeah.
for a week, stuff like that. So that's my attempt at who has been. I mean, I think I get misperceived a lot, because I sort of look a certain way and I have a focused face, but I'm actually just like, I love jokes. I love tell bad ones, and I love time with friends. People as a general theme is a theme that's very important to me.
Yeah.
I take really good care of the people that are close to me, and I'm like tender-hearted and sensitive, despite the gruff exterior. Thought I'd throw that out there for anyway. And the should I tell you how I got here now? Is
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
okay? So the yoga story, which I'll try to truncate because it could become endless, is basically that two things sort of converged in my early 20s to push me in this direction. Well, really three. So the first was like the physical side, which is that my back was really jacked up.
Yeah.
I have this congenital sort of defect in my lumbar spine that a lot of people have, and some people it affects more and others less. And it's called spondylolisthesis. So basically, like, here's my low back and here's my pelvis, and basically my low back is kind of like pushed forward over my pelvis, so it just puts a lot of pressure on that area. And throughout my early life with sports and conventional Western training, and I love sports, I'm not talking down on sports or anything like that, it's just like the way that I was training just made everything worse. And it got to the point where, like, by the time I was like 20, 21 years old, I was one of those athletes that was like almost could have been a great college athlete. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and things got derailed for various reasons, the back being the major piece of it. And it sort of forced me to look for alternative healing modalities because I wasn't ready to get back surgery at like 21 years old. And the paradox is that I looked very fit, and so it was like I had reverse engineered this body that had a certain aesthetic and temporarily functioned well in certain sports, but was just breaking down at a very early age. So that was piece one. Piece two was I got into yoga. I felt very at home eventually in those contexts, despite initially having a little resistance to it because there were not many, just to be totally straight about it, there were like not many straight dudes doing yoga, and I'm not in any way prejudiced against anybody at all. That's not my point. My point is just that there's like a certain activation that happens, and this has been actually written about, like in the book The Talent Code. They talk about how, like, after there was a tennis champion in a certain Eastern European country, that then all of a sudden all the young girls wanted to be tennis champions, right? So it's
Yep.
like when I finally got to interact with like a teacher who I felt was more like a mirror of me, I was like, oh, okay, I have a place here, right?
Yeah.
And so that physical practice eventually gave me a home to process other things that were pretty intense. I lost a partner to, or an ex-partner to suicide, and I hated my job. And those two things happened at like were ongoing at the same time. And it was like I didn't know how to process emotion. My early life was very much about being stoic in the face of, some interesting family dynamics that involved some pretty intense scenarios with flashing lights and whatnot that I'm not going to articulate in any great at length at this point. But my answer was like stoicism and like I'm okay and I'm a good kid and I'm a good boy and I'll just like that's the easiest way through this. And I started going to yoga, and eventually I was dealing with these things that were coming up, and it just felt like the yoga class was the only place that I could go and like feel some emotion. And I had this amazing teacher who was technically not really that physiologically adept. Like he didn't know the body that well or anything like that. He was kind of old school, and he
Yeah.
was this like 6'4" gay man who used to call me son, and like it was like only he could get away with this. And he just used to say to me in class, like he'd be like, "Straight boys can cry, Ben," like stuff like that in New York City back in like this was probably around 2003. And it just really gave me a place to start to process things. And I went to my first yoga teacher training as a way to just like quit the job I was doing and like take a break from normal life. I had bought this apartment in New York City. I rented it out to pay for my expenses, and I went to LA and I did this training, and I didn't really have a plan. And then what happened was I came home on Monday, and on Tuesday I taught 2 yoga classes at that guy's studio. His name was Raphael. He basically just like he was like, "You're going to start now," and so I'm very grateful to him for giving me that option, or really not giving me an option. And then I had this vision of the retreat thing,
Yeah.
and I had familiarity with the south of France. I had access to a property there. And so the first year that I was teaching yoga, I convinced like 9 New Yorkers to come on this first ever yoga retreat in the south of France. That was 2007. And honestly, I kind of wish I was more oriented towards the pragmatic side of business, but I've never had a plan. I was just like, well, that went well. Next year, let's do 2, and then
Yeah.
all of a sudden it was like 12 of them a year. And that, to try to make this long story a lot shorter, COVID, can't go to France, had a plan, a sort of a long-term dream of moving to Montana because I knew that I wanted to continue to run and evolve the work that I was doing, which was this sort of cozy luxury retreat and teacher training and lifestyle experience. But I wanted to do it in a place where I could see myself living permanently. And as much as I loved France and had opportunities to potentially make myself a European, something always stopped me. Maybe it's that my parents are older and they live in the US. Maybe I don't know what it was. I honestly don't know. But just expedited the need to make a move. And a year ago, I purchased this place where I'm sitting now. And I've been running retreats at other places in Montana. And I'm in phase 1 of retreats here where we have a smaller capacity of about 10 people. And depending on how the bookings play out. And then my hope is if everything goes the way that I'm hoping it goes with the permitting process and everything like that, that we turn this space into a really beautiful destination that still honors the fact that I'm in a quiet place bordering a national forest and, helps people be nourished by nature, but also respect it.
Well, I love nature. So I'm trying to figure out if like I'm going
Are we best
to,
friends now?
yeah, we're totally best friends right now. I'm going out to, I haven't been to too many places out in your neck of the woods, but we have a trip coming up in September. We're going to Jackson Hole,
Oh, cool.
Wyoming, not too far away. And just there's so much beauty in the vicinity. I can see some of the reflection off of your windows
Yeah.
behind you.
I didn't do that on purpose at
No,
all.
I mean, it works really well. And not only
Yeah,
that, but
subtle marketing.
the
Yeah.
red and the green are a nice color contrast as well. So a lot of things are going well for you. There's this famous quote is like every path is the right path. And
Mm,
just the way you're sort of describing like how you got into this and ultimately what your goals and ambitions are. I don't know, it
mhm,
just made me think that it's like it's so interesting, like the different doors that open up in our life. And yet here you found yourself in a beautiful part of the world. And I love the way you sort of started this, where it's not just teaching people yoga, it's teaching them what wellness and good quality of life can mean. And I think that's
yeah,
fairly
and
profound.
totally. And having a practice or various practices that fall under the, greater container of practice that enliven you and allow you to do better at whatever you're doing. And I think sometimes, something that I'd like to point out is that I think oftentimes in these podcasts, right, it's like you get these people up here and they're selling their, super efficiency productivity method and everything's perfect and rocking. And I just I want to say, man, it's everybody struggles, and that's why the work that I think you're doing is important. Sort of collating and organizing habit forming options for people so that they can integrate them into their lives, because I think the challenge with it is that there's so many options and so much information available nowadays. It's right. It can
Yep.
almost be toxic, and I think that it's almost like this kind of stuff is almost more like a liberal arts education, where it's like they've gone out of favor because it's like, well, what do you actually learn? You're not learning a career. It's like, well, no, you're learning how to think and how to assess and examine. And I think that's it's really not that any one of these methods, the Ben method or whatever, is superior to any other method. It's just like you got to pick something and stick to it and sign onto a process and see where it takes you, and understand that that it's not going to insulate you from struggle or self-doubt. It's more about how do you deal with those things in those moments. And that's, I think, the magic of it, of a yoga practice or a meditation practice. Or I'm almost not even calling things yoga anymore because I just don't even know what it is anymore, but just a practice that allows you the space to observe how you're feeling while you're doing something without making the feeling the defining factor of you.
Yeah. I had a lady who I think very fondly of. Her name's Uma Katari out of India. I've known her for a couple of years now, and she's sort of like an energy coach, and she doesn't like the word habit. She likes the word practice.
Right.
And you can make an argument either way. Habits are supposed to be automatic to some extent once you ingrain them into your identity. And I think there's some power in that. But her point is, and I think this really is touching on what you're saying, is the fact that a lot of the things that we do that may be beneficial for our mental health and our wellness, we're practicing them a lot. Nobody's living a perfect life. Whether it's a gratitude practice or it's a fitness thing or it's nutrition, there's these ups and downs. And one of the fun things I take out of this podcast is, so many of the people that have been on in the first 20-ish episodes, they are disproportionately experts in their fields, in the sense of they've read all the books, they've read all the studies, they're coaching people. They know so much about these categories. Whereas I don't think the average person is going to quite go to that length to read the books and the podcast. They're sort of just struggling to make their way through life. And
it's so granular. I think about that sometimes. And it's one of the imposter syndrome elements that I struggle with is man, I'm not good enough at X skill to teach it to blah, blah, blah. And I was on this men's retreat where I was leading movement and meditation. It was a 5-day off-grid thing recently that I actually wasn't running, which was really cool because I'm always running the event. So it was quite cool to be at somebody else's event and just offer my little piece. And because one of my skills is actually the ability to integrate a lot of different modalities and introduce people to them. But I sometimes get caught in this, well, I'm not an expert in this, I'm not an expert in that. And one of the dudes said to me, he's like, well, you're our expert, because what you know compared to what we know is right. So I think it's important to just interact with people to get perspective, and that granulation of skill and topics can become also toxic, because when we get to the point where we argue, it's I guess you just have to know when it's time to be in the minutiae and when it's time to use broader strokes, depending on who your audience is and who you're working with. It's some people just hear a nice song. Some people want to talk about the technicality of the music if they have the vocabulary.
Yeah, I always find imposter syndrome such an interesting one. My wife is a beauty expert, influencer, whatever you want to call it. I mean, she's got 25 years in this, and she rocks it on social media. I mean, she's been a professional makeup artist, and she'll even run into this am I good enough? And I think it's so interesting. We're very fragile when it comes to those things. I want to dive in, Ben. You know so much, even just the way you've sort of described your background. And I'm a big advocate that even if you're not an expert in mental health and wellness in any way, shape, or form, you've lived your life.
You know what?
What?
Just funny parallel that I just have to
Yeah.
address. My girlfriend is also in that space.
Oh,
She has
okay.
a skincare brand, yeah, called Koa Life. It's like all natural, organic skincare. So maybe our ladies need to get together and, I don't know, save
Yeah.
faces all over the world or something like
No,
that.
that's a
But
good. It's a small world. I wouldn't be shocked if she knew her of some way, shape, or form.
you said something else in that I wanted to address, and now I've lost it. All right, let's keep moving because I lost that piece.
No, no worries. If it comes back to you, just let me know. But you know, I want to dive into like, so much at this stage in your life. There's so many things that you do to take care of yourself. As you've sort of stated,
Mhm.
in a lot of ways, you wear a lot of your habits on you. You're in great shape. So you can make some assumptions as to like how that came about. But I'm curious, like, is there a habit for you at this stage of your life that really stands above the rest in terms of supporting your mental health, your wellness, and ultimately your success as a human? What would you say?
Well, I would say it's the one that I find the hardest to act on. Because
Okay.
it makes the biggest difference. Because it's what you pointed at regarding the distinction between habit and practice, I think is really astute.
Yeah.
Because habit almost indicates unconscious, right?
Yep.
And that doesn't necessarily mean negative, but habit is like an unconscious competence,
Yep.
right? But you could be really good at doing something that's not so good for you, right? Or you could be really good
Mhm.
at doing something that's good for you. It's like, some people are just like, it's like, wow, you're amazing at being annoying. Like, have you practiced that your whole life? Like, you know what I mean? Um, and then other people, it's like, wow, you're so amazing at being supportive, you know? So practice, I think, just indicates that it's a conscious second nature game. What I mean by second nature game is like it's scholastic, it's something that you learn on purpose. And
Mhm.
so one of my teachers has this beautiful metaphor of first and second and third nature. First nature being what you're born with, like what you come into the world with, what's
Okay.
unconscious. You have second nature is you learn to read, right? And then third nature is what are you going to read? And
Mm.
so that the distinction between practice and habit, right? Because my habit, and this is where how I'm going to answer your question,
Yeah.
my habit is I go to bed late.
Okay.
It's been a habit of for my whole life. Even tracking back to college, writing papers till the wee hours of the morning, and then when I started my retreat business, working on promotional materials all night long, and then going to bed at 5 a.m. And like this is, I mean, and
Yeah.
then living in Europe where everything happens a little later and whatnot. And as I've gotten older, my world starts earlier. It's
Mm.
like it's harder to live outside the lines in that way. And I just, there was a time where like it didn't matter. Like, okay, maybe I'd go to bed at 4 o'clock in the morning, sleep till 12, and that was my. It's not like I wasn't working; I was just
Yeah.
working later.
Yeah.
I remember reading about like the Keith Richards biography, and the guy just worked all night and then would sleep it off. But that's what you get to do maybe if you're a rock star at the level of Keith Richards, or that was just how he would work. This almost like manic mode of creativity. And I kind of have operated that way for a long time. There's moments where some of my best practices, just home physical practices, it's like I hem and haw, and then all of a sudden at 9 p.m., I'm getting started and I'm having dinner at midnight. And it's like, but it's just not, that just doesn't work anymore. That's the difference between habit and practice. The practice is get in bed before 10 p.m. And it makes more impact on the rest of my life probably than any other one thing that I'm doing because I have everything else pretty well dialed,
Okay.
you know, like, and so it's tempting to say like, well, here's this perfect thing that I do all the time and my routine is just dialed and blah blah blah. And I know a lot of like influencers and people in this space are gonna like, and I get up at 4, and then by this time I've cold plunged, and then by this time I've that, and it's like I'm messier than that. Like
Yeah.
I'm trying to be better that way, And so just getting to bed early enough that I have enough time in bed where I can get good sleep and get up early enough that, you know, I'm off and running the next day. And the difference in how I feel is significant.
So I want to focus on the significance in a second, but let's go back to why this practice is so important. So you sort of painted a picture of like you for the vast majority of life have been a night owl, right? And I
Mhm.
wouldn't even argue a night owl. I mean, like 4 o'clock in the morning, I can probably count on one hand how many times I was up till 4 in the morning. But
Yeah.
we'll leave that
I've
aside
lived
for the moment.
I've
So
lived a life that's gone in a lot of different directions, you know. It's
so why is getting to bed at 10, why is that so important? Like, why not just continue the late night owl tendencies that you've had for
it's
so
just
long?
not congruent with what I'm trying to do at this point in my life, nor has it been for, you know, quite a long time. I've just allowed myself to suffer through it, you know, and operate sleep deprived and that kind of thing. And so the reason why it's so important is because it's hard for me, right? So like if I was going to talk about my physical practice, I will do my physical practice no matter fucking what.
Yeah.
Like uh, I've been in a, I mean, it's not like, I'm not trying to say like, oh, my life is so hard, but like, I just remember comical memories of like being in an Airbnb in Rome in the middle of winter where the heat broke and it was literally like colder in the apartment than it was outside. It's
Yeah.
probably like 37 degrees. And I'm like doing my practice every morning before I went to teach workshops in like in like my ski gear,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
like long, like I'll do that no matter what, you know, I'll sacrifice other things to do my practice. And that habit has been productive for me because without that dedication to that piece, I wouldn't have done any of the other things that I've done in my work and my career because my practice, whether it's the yoga, the meditation, the hand balancing, the locomotion, the strength work, whatever, like those are the things that are me going into the lab to stay inspired to
Mhm.
give to other people, right? So it's like while I do require a bit of discipline to do that stuff, it's like I have that.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have that, built that, you know, I've trained that muscle. So the practice that might be the most important one is the one that is not natural, is not
Yeah.
easy,
Yeah.
right? Like, you know, it's like, I mean, there's so many, we could draw so many parallels. It's like, you know, for the person who's quite sedentary, it's like getting up and moving. For the person who's a habitual over exerciser to the point of, you know, like burnout and injury, it's like more recovery.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we're attracted to our imbalances like a magnet. So it's like the practice that's most important is the one that brings you back to center from whatever your inclinations are.
But I guess where I'm stuck on, like, why this practice is so important, like, is
Mm.
it just because of the lifestyle you've been creating over the last handful of years? It requires you to wake up earlier? Like, I
Yeah.
guess I just don't
Yeah.
understand, like, why
And
you can't just.
also, here's the thing, like,
Yeah.
there was a point in my 20s, right, where, like, I mean, there was definitely an irony. Like, you know, I'd go teach some yoga classes, and then I lived in New York City. I'd, like, go meet some friends at the bar, and, like, you know, and then I was trying to live two different lives at the
Yeah.
same time, you know, and then things sort of change and shift, and I had less responsibilities at that time, you know, financially and otherwise, and so it's just I've also just become aware that when I'm in the rhythm of the earth, like I feel better.
Yeah.
You know, like I see the sunrise, I see the sunset, I feel like I'm part of something. And it's
Yeah.
beautiful, you
Yeah.
know? And so it's like there's I think there's an importance to the practice of sensing what feels good and what doesn't. It's like your five senses. There's this yoga word, Sanskrit word called siddhis, which means yogic superpowers. And it's like, you know, the ability to transcend space and time, which is not as woo woo as you think it is. It's like when, you know, if you're having a rough time, how do you speed time up? You know, if you're late to the airport, how do you slow time down? You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the first cities are your five senses because it's magical that you have senses that orient you in space and time and give you insight and information perpetually that if you actually listen and pay attention can direct you towards growth and happiness and less suffering. You know, it's like think about like
Yeah.
taste. It's like the most how lucky are we? Like food tastes good and it
Yeah.
nourishes us, but then you have to be a little discerning too because it's not just taste, right? Because some people, if it was just taste, it's like they would live on cotton candy. So you have to also be in touch with the inner sensations of like how you feel and how'd you sleep after you ate that thing, and you know,
Yeah.
so that.
So let's get into some of the tactical stuff for you, because this is a practice and because it sort of goes against with the way you've lived a good chunk of your life. Are you just setting alarms? Like, I mean, I have to imagine you just naturally want to stay up. So how are you forcing yourself? What are
Yeah.
you turning off social media? Are you taking a bath? What are you doing? Dimming the
I'm
lights? Like
trying to,
what?
well, one thing that I've been doing that again is going to sound a little bit like, oh, this privileged life, but I have a friend who's been here in Montana, staying with me for a few weeks, and we're working on some really cool artistic film projects that will kind of share the Montana experience of the project that I'm creating here,
Okay.
in a way that will resonate with my sensitivities as someone who appreciates the artistic side of things, like
Okay.
instead of just like a straight, like, buy this, come here. I just want to share, I don't know what it feels like to be here. And so
Yeah.
we've been working on that. And part of that and part of our routine has been every evening we've been trying to go swim in a river,
Okay.
and we've been trying to eat dinner before we do that. And having that, like, delineation in the day has been very powerful. And it's also pushed my eating window significantly earlier, because
Yeah.
left to my own devices, like, dinner might happen at 10 o'clock. So that's been a big thing, pushing the evening meal earlier, and then just doing some kind of like nice outdoor moment activity. And I think, it'd probably be pretty easy for people to sit back and think like, well, I don't have a river near me, but there's like something, like,
Yeah.
you can go for a walk, you can look out the window, you can find some way to connect with just the sky above you, even in the middle of a city. I mean, there's beautiful stuff to look at in a city. Like, go
Yeah.
stare at, an inspiring piece of architecture, or the way that, the depth of one building, and then space, and the negative space, and then another building, and how the street looks, and just lose yourself in that for a minute.
Yeah. That's interesting. So it's almost like when you're saying that, it's making me think of like habit stacking, of how you've sort of like reshifted like your priorities at night to earlier in the day from like the eating, and then it triggers some outdoor event, which then triggers sort of like a downtime, like sort of an interesting way of going about it. You made a comment a little bit about, and I want to sort of like tail off with this before we flip over to a mindset that's really impacted you. You mentioned that this has had a really significant impact on your life, and I'm curious if you can just elaborate on that a little bit. Like, as you practice this, go to bed at 10, you didn't say it, but I have to imagine, just based on everybody needs about 6 to 8 hours of sleep, it's shifted when you wake up, which probably
Well,
shifts your
that's
morning.
actually, so that's a big part of it, is that, I'm 43 now, and the days when I could just like sleep till whenever are gone, are over, you
Yeah,
know? And because my life for a long time was operating under this like heavy, intense, immersive season, followed by time sort of off.
mhm,
And when I was running the retreat center in the south of France the last few years, things were running really smoothly, to the point where I had responsibilities in my off seasons, but not to the level that I do now trying to build a new business. And my expenses are significantly higher now than they were. And just a lot of things have changed, right? So
yeah,
it's like I just feel much more responsibility and inclination to just get going
yeah,
sooner. And also, I just don't like, I don't have the option, nor do I have the ability to just like sleep it off, right? So it's like I'm waking up
yeah,
earlier no matter what. So it's like I may as well get to sleep earlier and feel better. And what I notice is that, I mean, it's so simple, but just feeling better makes everything go a lot better.
yeah. It's so interesting how you, when you raise the bar in your life or induce some necessity, how you reprioritize the things that you do to achieve it.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really interesting. Let's pivot over to a mindset. So, sort of in a similar format, like for where you're at right now, is there one mindset that really stands above the rest? Once again, sort of contributing to your wealth, your health, your success as a person.
Focus, forgiveness, and momentum are really are the three that I'm working on to bring together in order to do the things that you just articulated, right? Like, so making good use of time by focusing well, and being clear about what it is that I'm trying to do right now, or later in the day, you know. And then forgiveness, it means just simply like, okay, not every day is the most productive day. You know, some days get a little lost, you know, some days there's a little despondency. Some days I'm a little bit of a sad boy. Like, you know what I mean? And it's
Yeah.
just like, all right, so like, okay, you know, you did that. Let's like, no need to explain yourself to yourself. Like, just what's on the list? What's on the list next? And instead of, you know, I think as entrepreneurs where we have to organize our own time, one of the traps that I fall into is being scattered during the day and then feeling like I got to make it up at night. Like finally I get going. And then that comes back to that sleep thing where it's like, no, man, forgive yourself for this. This is one day. You've done a lot of things well, you know, in the last
Yeah.
month. And that's where I think sometimes being a little less granular can be useful, right? Like just less, oh, like how did today go? Let's assess it. You know, it's like, well, today was bullshit. So let's shut it down and fix it tomorrow, you know? And then momentum, right? Like how you transition from one task to the next task,
Hmm.
how you create momentum when you don't feel motivated, because momentum becomes motivation, and rhythm fits within that. You know, everything has a rhythm. Life has a rhythm. It's like you're getting up with the rhythm of the earth and keeping a certain rhythm to your day, and having focus sessions where you're working on one specific thing before allowing yourself to move to the next thing. That these all sort of fit into that
Yeah.
paradigm of those three words that I thought of when you asked me that question.
No, I love that. I haven't heard that before. Let's try to parcel out a couple pieces of a few different ones here. I was going to focus on the forgiveness, just because I think that's so challenging for people. It's come up in a number of conversations. I remember speaking with Vasya Sarantopoulos out of the Netherlands, and I mean, just wicked smart lady. And we got into a lot of like non-judgment and self-compassion, which is
Mm.
really challenging for a lot of people, not to cast judgment, whether we're talking about a meal and they just didn't eat healthy or they skipped a workout. I mean, we could just go on and on and on.
Well, I just think it's again, how micro do you want to go? Because really forgiveness is acceptance.
Yeah.
And forgiveness maybe implies too much action. Like, because when we conceive of forgiveness, it's often through the lens of I forgive someone for this bad thing they did to me. So it's like there's almost this like slightly transactional
Hmm.
orientation with it. So I think forgiveness can be reimagined as accepting what is in the moment, not just that you ate a bad meal or whatever shit people do to themselves. You know what I mean? Like, and give themselves a hard time for it. But it's like, then the next step is, oh, and now I'm giving myself a hard time for it. I accept that too. Like,
Yeah.
I don't only accept that I ate insert food here. You know, like everybody's
Yeah.
got different food strategies. So it's like I could say something and someone could be like, but that's the best food in the world, you know? Like I would say kale. Like I eat kale. Now I feel like shit. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Someone else would be like, oh my God, kale. Love
Yeah.
kale.
Yeah.
You know? So it's not just what you did that you're giving yourself a hard time for. It's that you're giving yourself a hard time. Like that that's what observation and meditation can train,
Hmm.
is the mindful moment of not only the sort of macro action but the internal atmosphere, because once you acknowledge the internal atmosphere, then you can put on the right clothes for the weather.
Yeah. I like that. I want to talk about your momentum piece here because I was curious of the way you were going to frame that. But you said one thing specific. I'd love you to elaborate on that. I think it will resonate with so many people. Is you said momentum. How did you say it? You said momentum can bring upon motivation.
Yeah, momentum can lead to motivation.
And I want to hone on that because I think there's so many people I know that I talk to and I coach, and they're just like, whatever. They haven't found their movement practice, or
Mm.
exercise is so challenging, or they don't like the job that they're in. I mean, in a lot of ways, they feel like they're stuck. And
Yeah,
so
it's a terrible feeling. I
yeah, and I
really
think
empathize with that feeling. Yeah.
And so many people can be like, yeah, when it's sunny outside and there's butterflies and I feel good, like I can do anything. But let's just be
Hmm.
honest, as we've acknowledged a couple times in this podcast, you don't always feel like that. Even if you're the world's best athlete or the most disciplined individual, like you have these ebbs and flows sometimes throughout the course of a year, sometimes over the course of a decade, life events happen. And so I think a lot of people can resonate with I don't always feel like doing something that may be in my best interest. And so I'm curious, when
Mm.
you reach a particular moment, whatever it may be for you, where you are, not that I believe in motivation as the dominant way in which we should take action, but if you're not motivated to do something, how do you spark that momentum so that you get back onto track with whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish?
Sometimes you just have to force yourself to do it. Sometimes you just got to do it. Sometimes you have to have a conversation with yourself as if you're speaking to an unruly but high potential child, you know? And then there's just the simplicity of like, how do you want to feel?
Yeah.
Like, how do I want to feel? And what action do I need to take to feel that way? Also, saying no to certain things, right? Like going to sleep. Like going to sleep is less about all of the thousands of practices you could find online for going to sleep and much more about what do you say no to? Because if you just start saying no to like media and screens and phone calls and communication and more food and more stimulation, like that's more important for your sleep than the latest greatest sleep supplement, peptide, or meditation.
Yeah.
Like it's like you can do all that stuff and still not sleep because you didn't say no to the first things. It's like get the first things first. And I struggle with the motivation thing. Here's the deal for me. I know that the way that I operate best is I get up, I have like a little morning routine, maybe a little snack, and then I get to my physical practice. I have the luxury of doing that first thing in the morning because that's how my life is organized. Not
Mhm.
everybody has the time to do that, you know. And then I get into my like more computer seated work. And for years, I just had this realization recently, right? Because for years, I kind of gave myself a hard time about that. I was like, no, man, you got to prioritize the other stuff because that's what's going to build, to the next level that you want to go and all that kind of thing. And I'm like, wait a second. Not only has my practice created my business, but my practice, the whole point of the practice, because I I have definitely slipped down the slippery slope of like my practice is a performance to show people what I can do. Right? That's a
Yeah.
trap that I've fallen into that I will admit. A lot of people won't admit that, but I will admit that I have slipped down that slope before and it doesn't end well. But really the purpose of my practice is to give me the energy and aliveness and joy that gives me the momentum and motivation to do the other things that I want to do because there's a great feeling of having checked that box. It's like that little I mean, I guess it's a dopamine hit, right? It's like I did that. Check,
Yeah.
And it just feels good. And man, it's really important to do stuff that feels good. I'm not saying like be a hedonist and like shirk all your responsibilities, but like balance your life out. Like put some like if you feel like crap all the time, it's hard to do anything. And what's the point? Like, you got to go jump in a river sometimes,
Yeah.
Or it's just, what are you working for? And I'm not trying to be unsympathetic to the fact that, like, people got to work hard to pay the bills and that kind of thing. But in whatever amount is possible, within whatever organization needs to be done to carve out some time to just like make your inside atmosphere one that feels good, that feels like the sun is out, is so important for for anything else that you're gonna do.
I'm
You
going to
know?
add some context to this, but I want to see if I can tease a little something out of you.
Okay.
You live in such a beautiful place right now, and that may not have always been
Hmm.
the case. I don't exactly know what your environment looked like in the south of France, but I'm
Oh, it
curious.
was terrible.
Was it?
I'm just
Okay.
kidding. It was great. No, it was magical. Yeah,
Well,
it was an
it looked
absolutely
really
beautiful sport.
green behind you, which I can always
Yeah.
appreciate. So I'm curious, like, where does nature, if at all, come into play with some of these things, especially when you said the mindset, the focus, the momentum, the forgiveness? Like, how
Mm.
does nature, if at all, how does it support you in who you're trying to be?
Oh, I mean, we're all part of great nature. You know, like we're all the sons and daughters of the reflection that you see in my window. And the more opportunity that you have to connect to the rhythm of nature and the feeling of being immersed in it, I think the healthier you can become. And so it's important to find ways to do that. And it can be, look, I grew up mostly in New York City. I have
Yeah.
a lot of great friends who still live there, and they prioritize getting on their, bicycle early in the morning and riding into Central Park, you know, or just walking down the avenues and seeing the sunlight glinting off the buildings. So to me, nature is incredible nourishment. And I think it's very important to find ways. And this is one of my goals with like the Bozeman House and the project that I'm working on is I recognize that not everyone's ready to like dive into like a 5 day off grid camping trip where they got to carry all their own shit and,
Yeah.
you know, that kind of thing. But it's like, for example, like in October, we have a weekend retreat this next weekend, which is August, that people are arriving in like 48 hours. And then I have another one that I just launched that's going to be in October. And we're just doing little mini bits of digital detox. It's like, okay, so this afternoon into the next morning, like we're going to be off the phones. We're going to take a hike. We're going to do a mastermind session on the top of the ridge where we're still working on our plans and our careers, but we're doing it with a pen and a paper and a notebook and the power of the wisdom council of the community of the people around who just have insights that you might not get yourself and you might not get when you're so close to the problem. So I think nature is important, and I encourage people to find any way that they can to get out in it, and not to be intimidated if they can't do it all the way, because look, I live in Montana, right? Like I love being outside. I like camping and hiking and all that stuff. But like, there's a lot of people here that are just like, I mean, like I was recently on this retreat running movement and meditation in this men's retreat, and there was another dude who was teaching, wilderness survival skills. I mean, compared to that guy, I am like the ultimate like city slicker. There's always going to be someone that's like better at it than you, that's more rad than you, that's got, that can hike farther or faster or spend more time out there. So it's just about, getting off the phone and appreciating the wonder of the landscape and allowing the pristine landscape to diffuse into you because there's a healing that happens. And I don't know if I sound woo woo and I don't have the technical scientific terminology for this, but I know that when you go outside for a while and you detach, like things start repairing inside you.
Well, I got out of you what I was looking for on that, and I'm gonna add a little bit of context to it because I focus on so many different aspects of mental health and wellness, but one that I'm constantly anchoring back towards is the power of nature. For a lot of the
Mm.
reasons that you mentioned, we're all stardust, right? We're all connected, and this question started off with you as like, how do you get motivated, and start to build that momentum? And as you were talking, it made me think that like, people need to figure out what are those things that make them feel good, right? You were
Hmm.
talking about your practice and you said, hey, we should do things. And it's interesting when I'm coaching people, I'm always like, make a list. Like what are all those things that you feel like you need to do? Make the list when you're of an equilibrium, not too high, not too low, because your distortion of what you think is good or bad will be highly skewed. But when you're in a moment of clarity, you need to figure out what are those things. Is it running? Is
Mm.
it yoga? Is it eating a certain way? Is it walking your dog? Is it whatever? For me, it's gardening. Like, what is that list? And then whatever that list is that you feel like, hey, if I could do these things consistently, whatever the cadence is, weekly, daily, monthly, how do you
Yeah,
get them into your schedule and how do you build your life around that so that you
totally. And And a balance between ritual, like, which is what you're pointing at, and it's a little space for spontaneity, which for me
Yeah.
is easy because I live here, right? It's like, all right, boom, we're going to the river, and I think some degree of just childlike excitement at
Yeah.
playing hooky occasionally a little bit,
Yeah.
but not necessarily to go have a bunch of drinks or some other unproductive social interaction, right? It's like reframing that excitement and slight, almost like naughtiness, right? Like,
Yeah.
because most of the people who are going to be listening to this and interested in these topics, like, they're already trying.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, they're already giving it a good shot. Maybe we all need a little help around the edges, a little organization, a little tap on the rudder. But, like, I think it's really important to organize yourself so that you have the space for spontaneity. It's like leave time for play,
Yeah.
you know? And like, and of course, you can't shirk major responsibilities and just be like, oh, I'm blowing off this huge meeting to go jump in the river. But, like, there's times where it will be more productive for your productivity and mental health. And I'm going to continue to use the figurative river here to shut it down at 5 o'clock and go jump in the river than it will be to work one more hour.
Oh yeah.
And there are times where you have to work 3 more hours, but it's important to have the mental dexterity to be able to adjust and give yourself those little joy bursts. Otherwise, what's it for?
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about nature here, you made a comment of you didn't want to sound too woo woo. There is so much science coming out of how nature
Mm,
heals. I live
yeah,
in California. For anybody familiar with the West Coast, let alone California, I mean, we've had some horrific wildfires over the last 5
yeah,
years. I mean, there was one in 2017 that came through my town and like wiped out 15,000 structures. It was
mm,
mind-boggling. And there's science, and there was another one a couple years later that wiped out the town of Paradise up in Northern
yeah,
California. And what they're starting to find out is that people that have had these traumatic events happen to them, they call it forest bathing. And I think there's some other terms as well, but just being in the presence of a forest, hugging a tree, sitting
hmm
down or being mindful has profound implications to your mental health and your ability to be resilient amongst all the tragedy that may have happened. And so
yeah.
there's a lot to be
Because it's
said.
so vast, it's so
Oh yeah.
big,
Yeah.
it's so big, and you know, um, something my old Ayurveda used to say to me is like, "You're gonna be okay. You've already been here for millions of years."
I like that. I like that. I like that.
I mean, look,
Yeah.
we're all part of something that's been here already for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And that, I think you pointed at something really insightful regarding the power of the vastness of nature, or hugging a tree that's been around for such a long time. And it's just like, it just accepts. It's like I sit here in the summer and it's sunny and hot. And then I sit here in the winter and I watch the snowfall, and the landscape is just like, all right, this is what you're giving me today. And the weather in Montana can be so intense
Yeah.
in different ways, right? Like, you talked about the fire stuff. Like, I mean, it can get smoky in the summer in whether it's California or Montana, and that can inhibit your ability to be outside. And or there's like a week or two in the winter where like it can get so cold that you're just like, actually, nope, you know, um, and you just kind of learn to roll with it a little bit more. And also you learn how to adjust to be able to enjoy nature in those different circumstances. Like that Scandinavian saying about no bad weather, only poor preparation. Or there's an Ayurvedic saying that is similar. It's like no bad food, only bad timing, right? Like you're out in the middle of the woods, you get lost. I don't know. I'm just making up a narrative here. And
Yeah.
all of a sudden you find a stash of Tootsie Rolls. You know what I mean? Like that's the healthiest thing you've ever eaten because it's literally going to save your life, but if you spend most of your life not moving that much and your primary source of nutrition is Tootsie Rolls, it's a terrible idea, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Get out in nature,
But,
everybody. It will help you. The last thing I'll say
man,
about it is the clarity it brings too. I mean, when you're talking about
yeah,
vastness, whether we're talking about a valley, a meadow, an ocean, and a mountain peak, you rarely come up with your good ideas, let alone your clarity to life sitting at a desk somewhere. And so I
Yeah,
think the more you can get
absolutely.
out into nature and experience its novelty, the more likely it is that you will bring greater perspective to your life, and
Hmm.
hopefully help you realize you're connected and bring some more meaning. So anyways, nature, nature, nature. I guess
Yeah.
last question I got for you here, Ben. I ask all the guests this. I am incredibly sensitive to the human condition. I'm a big
Mm.
plant and nature guy. I think every person is special, and I'm always trying to figure, like, there's 8 billion of us on this planet. There's so many problems we run into, and so many of them make no sense to me whatsoever. And so I'm always trying to think, and a lot of the spirit behind building the standard is like, God, we're all going through the same thing, the human experience. And how do we nudge humanity in a more loving and kind direction? Because I truly believe, like, if we want that, we could make it happen. And so my question to
Yeah.
you specifically is, in all that you know, and in that greater context of all that's going on, is there a habit or a mindset that you feel that if you could just wave a wand and all humanity had it, you feel like would really nudge us in a more loving and kind direction? Is there one habit or mindset that stands above the rest for you?
Some conception of mindfulness, developing the ability to pause and react in a way that doesn't cause any more internal or external suffering. And that's, I mean, you could take it I had a dynamic recently with someone in a work, I'm trying to be as opaque as possible, this thing where I was quite frustrated with the situation, and at the same point was dependent on this person, for their particular role in this particular event. And it just came down to, like, why create, and this is such a micro personal level, right? But it's
Yeah.
like, why allow this to create any more suffering? Like, what's the least dramatic way to get to a solution that doesn't come from ego? Although it does a little bit, because I want to succeed, right? I
Mhm.
want the thing to go well, but it's like, I don't want to win this little battle. I want to have smooth sailing for the event, and so that's where I think, like, mindfulness comes in, where I'm just like, okay, we'll do it your way, provided that XYZ. And I'm not saying, like, give up or, like, drop your boundaries. I just think, like, there are a lot of scenarios in which we could all drop our armor a little bit
Yeah.
and just be a little more, like, loving and kind. And it's tough to do because the world, like, look, life is unfair, like, there's not, and so that is a practice that can help us deal with the unfairness of life and maintain our personal integrity regardless of the situation, right? Like, and you can think of integrity as the one thread that never has to unravel, and it's the worst feeling
Mm.
when it does.
Yeah.
And another thing I was thinking about when you asked me the question, I was like, well, man, a big part of just, like, having peace on earth, right, is, like, people having enough to
Yeah.
eat and, just live with basic needs. Um, when those basic needs are met, I think it takes a lot of the tension and the pressure off. And so I think we're very privileged to be able to have these conversations, because they indicate that, although our lives have challenges and we're all striving to do stuff, like, our basic needs are met, our primitive needs are met. And so I think a big piece of operating in the world and making the world a gentler, safer place is just actually making it a gentler, safer place where more people have more access to basic needs, which is a huge can of worms that I'm opening without a real solution. But I think that,
Yeah.
there are small ways that we can contribute to that larger
Yeah.
goal.
No, I love the perspective. It's always interesting when I ask this question because it is such a macro perspective, but I also think it's just a very important one. We all are highly interconnected. I do believe in the butterfly effect. What one person does in one siloed little part of our world does have implications to the rest of the world. And my
Yeah.
hope over time is that everybody can really embrace that and recognize, like, so many of the things that are so trivial that we fight over, whether it's within our inner circles or our communities or our countries, like they are so trivial compared to the needs of the many. And I don't always know that we're focused on the bigger picture. So I always love hearing people's perspective. So thank you for that. Ben, where can people go to learn more about you? Where's the right place to send them?
So there's a couple of places. I'm relatively active on Instagram, which is benjamin.sears. And then the other spot for now, the best website is benjaminsears.yoga, which is eventually everything's going to be rolled into this Bozeman House project. But for now, those are the two places. And then if people are interested in events here in Montana, best thing to do is get on the mailing list, because one thing that I'm very grateful for and proud of is that I have a really strong community of students and clients all over the world that tend to snatch up our events pretty quickly. So the mailing list typically gets information about that kind of stuff sooner. So that can be done through my website, or you can just send an email to bookings@luxyoga.com. That's luxyoga.com. So really there's like 3 brands at the moment. There's me, there's Lux Yoga, which was originally the France thing and then has become sort of the yoga education part of things. And then there's Bozeman House, which is going to have a really cool official launch soon. But we are, doing some intimate, really special events and have been here. So that's what's on. And then I'm going back into I've taken a break from the group online teaching space, but this fall I'll be coming back with some online programming for group classes. And depending on availability, I have time for one-on-one stuff as well.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to include all of that in the show notes. Ben, you've been amazing. I really appreciate the perspective. I felt like a lot of these podcasts, there's so many different doors we open up throughout them. It's totally hard to keep it focused and concise within an hour. I felt like I probably could have asked you a million more questions. So to be continued on this, but really appreciate you being on. I love watching you on Instagram, and it was great to hear more about your background. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I really appreciate the time and your drive in getting me on here. I know we've been back and forth for a while, so it really makes me feel appreciated that you made the effort to include me in your work, and I thank you for that. It's always nice to feel appreciated, and I think that's something that we can do for not just for each other, but I encourage everybody out there to just tell a friend you love them.
Yeah.
And not that little I love you text, like tell them something specific. Like, thank you for this particular thing about you. That's what really resonates with those pro-social networks in front of the old noggin.
Well said. We'll leave with that. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Standard. Before we go, click on the link in the show notes of this episode to learn more about today's guest. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with somebody who you think would benefit from it as well.